For us, ESG lands in the space around stakeholder engagement. That's why you heard so much in my bio about stakeholder engagement. For us, we sit in the external affairs organization for Duke Energy. We're a Fortune 125, one of the largest energy providers in the United States. We serve in 7 regulated territories, jurisdictions as we call them. And I wanted to start is, what is the ESG? You all are very well read on the topic, no doubt, but for us, we spend a lot of time talking to stakeholders externally to the company. So we define it as both a strategy that mitigates risk on behalf of the company, our customers and stakeholders, and creating value. For us, ESG has been an evolution. Environmental, social, and governance, that strategy was born out of, for us, corporate social responsibility, that CSR. CSR for us was nice to do. We're 15 years in to our legacy sustainability narrative. And what started out in sustainability was the nice to haves, the glossy photos in the reports, and ESG has evolved to a must do for companies. We can talk about federal policy later in the conversation, and some guidance that we're receiving from the SEC about what we must report as they finalize their rule. Investors and shareholders, as well as our large customers and to a growing degree our residential customers, expect us to define and report out the homework on the metrics related to our ESG narrative. So we are on a pathway to net zero. We're going to talk a lot about that tonight. And they expect us to be transparent in the reporting of those metrics. For us, it is who we are. It is part of the fabric. As I've said, we've had a 15-year legacy. I've been with the company over 20 years, as Benjamin said. For us, sustainability is at the employee base as well as the reporting and voluntary disclosures base. It's fundamental to the entire makeup of the company. Decarbonizing and our strategy around decarbonizing is at the heart of what we are doing and planning for all the way to 2050. For us, our ESG strategy, and I'm going to go into this in detail in a couple slides, is how we put capital to work. And we've proposed a $145 billion capital plan over the next 10 years on behalf of stakeholders, shareholders, and customers that are committing us with a plan around the infrastructure investment needed for that net zero pathway. While ESG is focused for us on the E piece around scopes 1, 2, and 3, all good things we're going to talk about in a moment, we are mindful that for some of our customers that aren't as committed on the E side, that affordability and those reliability metrics are just as important as the E pieces. And so for us, that balancing between clean, affordable, reliable is a sweet spot we need to work with in our regulated jurisdictions as we prepare, again, for long-term value and demonstrating that long-term value proposition to our stakeholders. So that's table setting on ESG. Next slide, please. So again, I don't want to make assumptions about the audience and how much you all are following utility news, but for us, the pace of change required for this, in some ways, our planning horizon around 2030 is almost tomorrow in some circles internally. The pace of change that we're undergoing in the company and in the industry, we have to balance that customer affordability and reliability with what is required for reducing our carbon footprint. In February of this year, we announced an addition to our Scope 1 2050 goal. And for those not versed in Scope 1, 2, and 3, we're going to talk about it in more detail, but let me just tell you what the goal is, and then we'll keep digging deeper. So in February, we announced that as part of our already occurring several years old goal of Scope 1 goals for net zero by 2050, we would fold in Scopes 2 and 3. And then in October 4th, we released this detail that we were releasing 2 intermediate goals for 80% reduction by 2040 on Scope 1, and for Scope 2 and 3, a 50% reduction by 35. The capital plan that we've outlaid is $145 billion in capital investment. And I mentioned this because it's important to us that we are positively contributing to our communities. Again, if not all of our stakeholders are focused on that CO2 footprint, they want to know, how is the company investing? What is that social balancing act for the S pieces? So for us, 85% of the plan is targeted around clean grid and grid modernization and our fleet transition. That for us means generating fleet transition. But we've also found that we're going to have a $250 billion positive economic output benefit to those communities over that 10-year capital plan. So it's not, again, it's it's being clear with our communities that there are other benefits from the business and this infrastructure transition. And then, of course, with we can't talk about ESG without talking about strong corporate governance. So the G part, this is our board diversity, board of directors refreshment work, so our supply chain commitments that we have, our political and trade associations reports that we produce, and climate reports. So strong governance at all levels of the organization and at the board of directors, of course. So next slide, please. This is more detail on that capital plan and what it means to our communities. This is important to us because the heart of our business is in the local communities. Though we are, like I said, a Fortune 125 company now, the heart of what we do is our customers. And so we want to also contribute positively to their communities through tax base, supporting local schools and community programs through our infrastructure investment. What we found in working on a study with EY, Ernst & Young is a consulting firm that you all probably know very well. We worked with them to identify that we'll have an additive impact of 20,000 additional indirect, direct, and induced jobs year over that capital plan. So again, trying to show the benefit that our strategy is not just a one-size-fits-all approach. There are benefits for job creation as we are growing our infrastructure, again, plan to meet a low carbon need. Next slide, please. I thought I'd reflect on the rising expectations of stakeholders. This might help level set for those that are not very familiar with the energy sector or utilities. We're a heavy regulated industry in our company in particular. And I just picked on 4 stakeholder groups here that we tend to work with very closely on both explaining our ESG strategy, but understanding what their needs are, because not just about us, it is about what our stakeholders are expecting from us as a partner in the community to have positive impact. So for investors, those ratings, those ESG rankings and ratings that you've been reading about in the Wall Street Journal, as you follow this conversation in the industry, those ratings and rankings are increasingly important. Investors are looking for a way to measure companies and understand with greater transparency all of the data that we're sharing and what that means for our strategy so that they understand it from an investment purpose. I will tell you that our fossil fuel exposure is a top driver for our ESG ratings and rankings, no matter the organization. And so increasingly there is pressure on us to lower our carbon footprint, as we've talked about for our net zero 2050 goals. And what we've found is there's increasing investment in the ESG space related to asset investment in terms of $140 trillion in total global assets. ESG is growing in its importance year over year for how money is directed, but also how companies are measured. So that's one perspective. That is the investor perspective on how we tell our ESG story externally. Environmental groups have a different perspective. So environmental groups are not all created equal, but I'll put environmental non-governmental organizations and social non-governmental organizations together, if you'll give me that grace. Many of the ENGOs are focused on not just a 2-degree warming commitment for the Paris Agreement, but increasingly pushing towards that 1.5-degree alignment. They are focused on pushing ahead to decarbonize quickly and more quickly, even ahead of 2050. They are encouraging us, and we have committed to, we'll talk about that in a second, to exit from coal. So we've set a 2035 goal for exiting our fossil fuel, our coal specific generation. Again, pending regulatory approval at the state level, of course. ENGOs would like us to increasingly commit to not any new gas build out. Gas has, for those following for the past couple decades in the industry, been a bridge fuel. And we have gas at the local distribution company level. So pipes to your home for gas stoves. Many of you all have read about that in the news, and bans on gas infrastructure build out in California. Let's move to regulators. So we are a regulated industry. My perspective is very much one of working with our regulators to help them understand costs and the opportunities that for us to better serve our customers more reliably with this plan. We use an IRP process, which is short for Integrated Resource Plan. That's the 6-part stakeholder engagement plan that Benjamin was talking about, that I've been part of through the company in Indiana and Kentucky. That's a way we engage the community, local stakeholders, where they give us feedback on our generation asset plan and tell us what we need to be doing differently, where their interests align, what they're interested in paying for or not. What we hear more and more is the third bullet. Reliability is of keen interest. I'll close this slide with just the customer piece. So in our own internal analysis of the top 24 large account customers, these are the large producers, manufacturers in our jurisdictions. The vast majority of them had GHG goals, net zero goals, or publicly stated sustainability commitments. They are increasingly finding themselves under pressure from investors to decarbonize faster. My scope emissions are their downstream scope emissions. And they are demanding more options from us in terms of products and services. So those are the expectations. Next slide. How we engage is to listen, learn, and adjust. So stakeholder engagement is the core for our ESG strategy. When we take an infrastructure project into the community, we need to listen to what that community wants to hear and see from us as we build out that plant, build out those grid resources. We need to learn what their priorities are. We used to have a strategy of more decide and defend, going into a community and saying, this is what we think is best, and then we would defend it. We're trying to be more engagement oriented. And so that means we have to adjust. So listen, learn, and adjust to create shared outcomes and shared value for our shareholders and our stakeholders. Next slide. So for us, ESG breaks down into the environmental, social, and governance components. For us, it's used to screen potential investments, obviously, but we focus on the metrics so that we can better provide transparency around the path that we have for achieving our own goals. So we will talk a lot tonight about the clean energy mix, coal and renewables, carbon emission reductions, setting targets and goals by year, being very transparent around the homework that we're doing so that investors and stakeholders can track us. We are focused on the role of our natural gas business unit, that local distribution company, and the role of natural gas in our generation mix going forward. Grid modernization, again, the transition of our fleet, transition for a cleaner grid is top of mind. We have our low emission vehicles, our EV strategy for our own vehicle fleet. And then we released a biodiversity and natural capital policy that's new for us. Just giving you a flavor, I'm trying to save you about 70 pages of ESG report reading from the ESG report that came out in April. Let's skip to social. In brief, this is for us, employee diversity metrics, health and safety is top of mind for utilities. For those of you familiar with the industry, safety is always top of mind. And so we're very transparent in the report out on that. Economic development, community investment. New in this space for us, I'd say, is environmental justice and just transition. These topics around energy equity and human capital management. This is a newer space for us. Duke Energy is trying to lean in here. And I'll go into more detail in a few slides about what we're doing in that space. And then governance. We get lots of questions from investors around board refreshment, board composition, board skill set, around executive management compensation. At the heart of what we do is a strong ethics culture. We released a new financing framework last year. We're trying to be increasingly transparent in that second to last bullet around political spend and political involvement. We have a trade association report that we released last April as well, and a climate report that we released a month ago. And then supply chain governance I've mentioned before. Next slide. So we're going to go into more detail on those net zero goals, so I'll hold that. For us, our renewables energy growth was very strong in 2021. So we need to have this kind of balanced portfolio as we were increasingly retiring coal through 2035. For us, social responsibility, we spent $8 million invested in social justice and equity organizations in the past 2 years alone. Our work with diverse suppliers and suppliers on the local level for that infrastructure build out is important to us. I'll just mention on the right-hand side, to give you a sense of history for where we started, we are at a 44% reduction of our CO2 footprint against a 2005 baseline as of December of last year. For us, we are a merger of a few different companies in the last 15 years. This reduction is important to us because it shows the proof in the pudding for our pathway to net zero. We're increasingly working on how to decarbonize the natural gas business unit. We wrapped into our 2030 goals a net zero methane target. So we spend a great deal of R&D time and strategic partnership, research and development time and strategic partnerships between our natural gas business unit and looking at new technologies around renewable natural gas, for example. Related to our fossil fuel fleet transition, we've retired 56 coal units since 2010. So we're just under 7,500 megawatts of coal retirements. We have another 16,000 megawatts plotted out as part of our 2035 goal. We've got 10,500 megawatts of renewables on our system as of last year. And then we're on track to, we've got a new goal that we released in the fall for 30,000 megawatts by 2035. We continue to work with, again, strategic partners, industry partners, our trade associations around R&D development. Technology and innovation is key for us. We'll talk about Zelfers in a moment, but there's a role for technologies that don't exist yet or very burgeoning as we get into the 2030s and 2040s on that pathway. Related to the social dimension, we create thousands of jobs in our communities every year. We've invested $6 billion in capital and economic development. We've worked, as I've said, worked on our EJ and JT, environmental justice and just transition principles. And then we were really proud last year was our most diverse hiring class for 35% female and 34% people of color hires. We report out on our EEO1 data in the ESG report. And then for governance, we have received a few accolades. We get a few awards. Those are detailed on page 3 if you need them. And then we talk about board refreshment and board diversity and how our board actually in 2021, every board of directors meeting that we had a climate agenda component to it. We're talking about the net zero pathway. It's just so important up and down our levels of governance. Next slide. So this is the road to net zero for us. It ends in 2050. I'll just point out a couple of new items. That 2035 goal for the 50% scope 2 and 3 reduction and the 2040 goal for the 80% scope 1 reduction. Again, we're on path for the 44% reduction is currently where we are as of 2021.
Duke Energy is undertaking one of the largest clean energy transformations in North America, which involves retiring coal-fired generation and replacing with cleaner forms of energy. As our CEO, Lynn Good, says, net zero emissions by 2050 is not just our climate strategy, it's our business strategy. I'm Jack Sullivan, VP of Investor Relations for Duke Energy, and I'm joined here by Catherine Neby, our Chief Sustainability Officer. She's here today to talk about the company's efforts on environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and corporate governance. Well, before we spend much time looking at where Duke Energy is going on its ESG journey, let's take a minute to reflect on where it's been. The company published its first sustainability report 15 years ago, long before a lot of ESG priorities even came into the conversation. So how would you react on how the company's ESG strategy has evolved over time?
When I think about Duke Energy, I have the unique privilege of having worked in sustainability, previously corporate social responsibility, and now ESG for over 20 years. And way back in the early 2000s, I was back here in North Carolina following graduate school, and I bumped into a person who is now a colleague at Duke Energy, who is out there talking about climate change and how Duke Energy was taking action. So this is not a new conversation to the company, and it's a real privilege to be here and to be part of that journey. We set, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, we set a refreshed agenda with respect to climate in 2019 with our commitment to net zero. In 2020, around this time last year, we also set a goal to net zero in methane emissions by 2030. And we're continuing to build on work that has been underway and lean into topics that are in the conversation today. Environmental justice would be one, the just transition is another. So while we've got laser-eyed focus on our net zero commitments, we're continuing to evolve our work forward to reflect the conversation, the needs, and the opportunities of today.
Yeah, so Duke and the entire utility industry have done a lot, but there's a whole lot more to do. Can you talk more about the challenges of balancing ESG priorities with...
All right, thank you. So as you heard Jack and Catherine talking about that, and I can send out that link if that's helpful to folks. We've got a couple YouTube explanations on our strategy. I thought I'd go into the scope 2 and 3 goals in more detail. So as we said, by 2030, when we less than 5% coal generation in our jurisdictions, again, we're a regulated business. We have to align with our state regulators on that plan. For 2030, for our electric gas business, this means, again, we're on target for this. We're at 44% now, but we're going to be at least 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2005 levels. And then that net zero methane goal stands. By 2050, we're going to be, in addition to the scope 1 target that I told you about, the net zero goal, we're going to be our net zero emissions from electricity purchased for company use. So in our markets where we're served by a regional transmission organization and RTO, those are your, we'll have purchase powers for scope, purchase power for resale for scope 3, and the purchase of fossil fuel generation for scope 3 as well. So what 1, 2, and 3 do is scope 1 is this is shorthand. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that we generate as a company. That's that 78 million ton footprint that we've talked about today. Scope 2 are the emissions that we buy and use in offices, assets that we have that are not inside our jurisdiction using our own emissions. So for example, our DC office is served by another utility. So those are our scope 2 emissions. And then scope 3 is this up and down the supply chain emission. And that's the procurement of power for resale to serve our customers. That's the transportation and purchase of fossil fuels for our generation and for our gas business too. So next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about the need for transparency. I won't belabor this, but for us, because I'm transitioning now, I want to talk about some of the social issues. Trust starts with transparency. You heard Catherine and Jack in that video talking about EJ and JT. We've made a concerted effort. This is not news for us, as she said. This is part of the fabric of who we are for 15, 16 years. But again, it's incumbent upon us to increasingly chart our progress and be transparent around that. Next slide, please. So when we talk to stakeholders, we talked about the types of stakeholders earlier and what is important to them. We also gather, we use an artificial intelligence tool to gather feedback that scours ESG reports, corporate social responsibility reports, for what other stakeholders are talking about, what information they are seeking, and how they rate it and rank it. And it fits into 4 buckets around justice, equity, and inclusion, climate resiliency, vibrant economies, and employees, customers, and communities. If you're looking at our ESG report, you need a link to that. Benjamin and I can send that along. It's around pages 15 to 17. If you're looking at the report, this is how we are bucketing the priorities that we hear from external stakeholders and how they want us to report out on our progress, given, again, our footprint in society and how we're managing risk on behalf of the company. I think much of this we have gone through. I'm just going to point out that charitable giving piece, the Duke Energy Foundation. There are over $40 million of spend in communities every year. We haven't talked about that, so I just thought I'd throw that data point out there for you. We've talked about the environmental health and safety, employee diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all priorities for our stakeholders and for us. So energy equity for us, next slide, is understanding customer vulnerability and affordability challenges, especially in the last 2 years of our COVID environment, increasingly high winter heating bills that we're expecting going into this winter heating system or season. We work with policymakers, we work with customers to identify ways that we can assist customers, find them aid, connect them to social service agencies. That's the role of a portal that we've created to help them access funds as they've needed. These are just some examples of rental assistance programs, LIHEAP funds, and our Share the Light Foundation funding to match assistance for customers dollar for dollar when folks contribute to it. Next slide, environmental justice. I'm not giving these fair credit, but I know it's 7:48, 6:48 where y'all are, so I'm trying to go fast. Environmental justice, we released these principles a year ago on the heels of COP26. This year for COP27, we released our just transition principles. I'm throwing these up on a slide because for us, the build out around seeking community input in that third bullet naturally led to our just transition principles that we released last month. So again, this is part of the listen, learn, adjust stakeholder engagement for being transparent about our role in the community and being a better listener to stakeholder needs. Next slide, for our just transition principles, we're trying to strike that balance. Again, you hear me say balance several times tonight about various customer and stakeholder needs. We have a workforce that is transitioning. So we have a talent acquisition team focused on our workforce planning. As we transition from fossil fuel generation, what are the additional skill sets and trainings needed? And engaging our customers and communities. We have been a legacy presence for sometimes decades in these communities. We've got, as I said, a philanthropy presence through our foundation. What are the needs of that community as we transition? So close to y'all. So I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio tonight, where I live. And in Indiana last year, we accelerated the retirement of the Gallagher plant. For y'all that may know it, it's across from the Louisville, city of Louisville in Southern Indiana, where we serve customers. And we spent 6 months engaging the community, listening, doing a gap analysis in the community on what were the social service needs that we could help transition as we are closing that plant and now have closed that plant. And they included things that came up in stakeholder sessions around mental health and beautification contributions that are not part and parcel with what you would think of a utility, but they were the need from the community's perspective of what they would need going forward. And so we invested in the community through philanthropy in that way. That's just an example. And then of course, economic development, which we've talked about. Benjamin, next slide, please. Very wordy slide on the just transition principles. They are bucketed, you will not be surprised, across employees, customers, communities. So support for our workforce, engaging in our communities. This concept in the third bullet, we haven't talked about accessible energy for customers. So increasingly reliable and affordable. And how are we making this available to all customers as they are on their carbon transition journey as well? And then of course, community development for us. So how are we enabling community vitality? Next slide, please. With this, I thought I would close the front part of the dialogue of the conversation, turn it into a dialogue. So Benjamin, I turn it back over to you.